World War II, also known as the Second World War, created conflict between almost every part of the world during 1939 to 1945. There were the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, and the Allies, France, Great Britain, and the United States, Soviet Union, and China. The result of the war was 40 to 50 million deaths, making it the largest and bloodiest war in history, and a win for the Allies.
Kamikaze is a word to describe Japanese pilots in World War II. These pilots would deliberately crash into their enemies, usually ships. Most kamikaze planes were regular fighter planes and were usually loaded with bombs and an extra supply of gasoline before they would crash down onto the enemies. Yucky. The best defense against the kamikazes were to station aircraft destroyers before the larger vessels. That is for when the kamikazes came closer, they can be taken down before getting close to the vessels with more people on it. After the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and destroyed the U.S.'s marine fleets, they now aim to destroy more of their enemies in hopes of having the U.S. surrender. The U.S. used their last two resources, aircraft carriers and submarines, to protect America from the Japanese. After Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the U.S. declared war on Japan and Germany, entering the war for good. Instead of getting instant revenge on Japan, the U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt decided to take out Germany due to its easily pierced defense. They needed to beat the time before Germany got their hands on highly destructive weapons.
On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and launched the U.S. into World War II. Before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. was involved with the European War by giving them and other anti-fascist companies supplies. The attack on Pearl Harbor unleashed fear about national security into the hearts of U.S. citizens. In February 1942, 2 months after Pearl Harbor, FDR issued Executive Order No. 9066. Order 9066 began the relocation of all persons of Japanese ancestry, citizens, and aliens. They were to be moved from inland to outside the Pacific Military Zone. FDR's order was set to keep Japanese people away from any harm put on them by Americans who had strong anti-Japanese attitudes. Roosevelt's order affected 117,000 people of Japanese descent, 2/3 of whom were native-born citizens of the United States. The Issei were the first generation of Japanese in this country. The Nisei were the second generation, numbering 70,000 American citizens at the time of internment. Within weeks, all persons of Japanese ancestry, whether citizens or enemy aliens, young or old, rich or poor, were considered and ordered to assembly centers near their homes. Soon, they were sent to permanent relocation centers outside the restricted military zones.
When attacking, the Germans would envelope the enemy armies and what would they do? I don't know. The Germans would threaten their lines of supply and communication to then fight them unexpectedly. They planned on quick and deliberate actions. The Wehrmacht held an estimated amount of 10 million people and did not contain the most sophisticated technology. Approximately 20% of the massive German infantry is made up of horses and tanks. The Germans focused on very aggressive attacks that consist of speed, quick weaponry, and a significant reliance on automatic weapons. Their reliance on machine guns, MG-34 and MG-42, takes away their accuracy and aim. Blitzkrieg, also known as Lightning War, was an offensive tactic that is known for having a lot of success in warfare by the German military. This method combines tanks, motorized infantry, and artillery, and the German Air Force Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe would give support in the air by bombing targets and taking superiority over the air. Communication between the different forces was very important, so they used the radio to coordinate their attacks. Although Blitzkrieg was a very powerful form of offensive techniques, it was not as successful when up against well-organized defenses. Lightning War was very vulnerable to counterattacks, and the Soviet commanders soon learned to pierce the Germans with great defense lines and guns and infantry. By 1943, the Germans' tactics had completely failed, and they were forced to be in a defensive war. May of 1940, the German Wehrmacht used Blitzkrieg to attack France, which contained the French and British army. and destroyed them. The French attempted to refight this battle with new mobile and all-arms warfare. The British and French believed that the Germans would attack from the north, so the Germans sent large armed divisions north to make it seem like the Allies were correct. While the divisions headed north, the main section of the German army headed south into the Ardennes. Their goal was to penetrate the Meuse River in Sedan. Germany first used Blitzkrieg on Poland as a test. The technique was very effective and crushed the combined forces of the four nations.
As the war was ending, the Germans retreated into the Reich, leaving the concentration camp population to further suffer. Since the Germans had left, the SS Guard forcibly evacuated concentration camp prisoners to be sure none of them were liberated as the front approached. Concentration camps were locations of horrendous and perverted medical experiments. All experiments, such as trying to find vaccines for lethal diseases, were done against the prisoners' will. Not only were the experiments done with ill intent, but they were mostly based on fake science and racist fantasy. Thankfully, in 1944-45, the Allied armies liberated the concentration camps. Sadly, there were many deaths before and after liberation, since the prisoners were too weak to survive. Auschwitz, being the most recognizable concentration camp, was easily the most terrifying. Estimates of the number of victims at Auschwitz between 1940 and 1945 are 1,095,000 Jews, 140,000 non-Jewish Poles, 23,000 Roma, or Gypsies, 15,000 Soviet prisoners of war, and 25,000 others. Each prisoner was given a tattoo and a serial number that was sewn to their uniforms. If you didn't receive either, that meant you were being sent directly to the gas chambers. There were 3 camps in Auschwitz. Auschwitz I was the main camp. It was constructed in 1940 for 3 purposes: to imprison enemies, to supply forced laborers, and to serve as a site to kill small, targeted groups of the population. Auschwitz II was constructed a year later. This camp had the largest total prisoner population and was divided into 10 sections with electrified barbed wire fences. Auschwitz III was built in 1942 and housed synthetic rubber works. It also had a so-called labor education camp for non-Jewish prisoners who were perceived to have upset and/or violated German-imposed labor discipline.
In order to gain the upper hand in the war against Japan, the U.S. island hopped to get closer to their target. Island hopping is a tactic that involves traveling to smaller enemy islands that are less secure than the larger ones. This tactic assisted with turning the tide on the war. The French prepared to defend the Meuse, but after the Germans uncovered the new tactic, Blitzkrieg, onto Poland, the French decided not to change their defense. They believed that they would succeed where Poland did not. From earlier information, we learned that Blitzkrieg is a German tactic where they will use mobile troops, the Luftwaffe, and firepower during their offense. Since the French believed their strategy would work and did not change, they would not succeed in this battle. Paris formed a military doctrine making the defense primary and fighting the war. They planned to first blunt the incoming invasion, and once they were sufficiently weakened, the army will then be on offense. To strengthen their defense, the French constructed heavily defended fortifications to create a border between themselves and neighboring countries. This defensive structure is infamously known as the Maginot Line. Roosevelt and Churchill teamed together to form a blockade of supplies to Germany and to bomb the cities of Germany. This tactic was to gain more German land and to advance slowly. They called this plan closing the ring. Before putting this plan into action, the two allies decided to take back the French territories in Africa. After taking back the land in Africa, the Allies turned to invade Germany's ally, Italy. They invaded the Italian mainland and Sicily. The point of invading Italy was to push the Italian people to overthrow Mussolini and to also put fear into Germany by giving the thought of the Allies, US, British, and French, would travel through Italy and travel to the border of Austria. Germany then began to entrench themselves into Italian land. In World War II, about 410,000 German civilians were killed due to the air raids done by the Allies. From July of 1944 to January 1945, an average of about 13,536 Germans were killed monthly. The Allies did not just bomb cities, but smaller villages as well. One would predict that the mass bombings would most likely cause devastation to both the population and productivity of the country, but it did not bring down either. The production was only plummeting in the final year of the war, but before that, the people of Germany kept on producing due to the luxury rations and special foods granted by working. Unlike some would think, the Germans kept on supporting the cause of the war even though they were repeatedly facing a decrease in population.
Both African American men and women registered and volunteered for World War II and served in many different parts of the armed forces. Although they were a part of these teams, they suffered from discrimination and segregation. Despite their situation, they served their country and earned high praises from their struggles and sacrifices. The Army held a deep distrust in the quality of black soldiers. Although the Army needed many men to be in field during combat, a majority were given logistical jobs. Gradually, the critical need for manpower caused people to relax and allow black combat units to be active.